For this afternoon, we're going to be switching and going a little bit more towards the rhetorical aspects of this. This morning, we had a panel on social media and a panel on some historical perspectives on the topic, which I think were very good, and I expect nothing less from this fine group here. Our moderator for this panel is Jeff Bennett, and Jeff has been a very active member of our planning committee for this, and I want to thank Jeff for all of his help and participation in helping to put this together, as well as the other planning committee members, which I was going to read off of our website, which I understand crashed this morning. And so we, of all days in which people may be looking to download an agenda and things like that, you know, perfect. So I will later thank publicly our planning committee members. This morning I went through all of the thank you to all of our co-sponsors, and there is a poster outside. And if you just take a look, and I think the nicest thing about that is just the breadth of the groups that are interested and willing to put their name to this and help in one way or another, and that thus the importance of this topic. So Jeff is an assistant professor in communication studies at the university, and he recently published his first book, Banning Queer Blood: Rhetorics of Citizenship, Contagion, and Resistance, which investigates the federal donor deferral policies that prohibit gay men from giving blood. Professor Bennett's work has also appeared in the Quarterly Journal of Speech, Critical Studies in Media Communication, Communication and Critical Cultural Studies, Text and Performance Quarterly, and the Journal of Homosexuality, and the Southern Journal. He's currently working on another book, tentatively titled Critical Conditions, Diabetes, and the Management of the Human Body. The National Communication Association recently named him the recipient of the Carl R. Wallace Memorial Award, and he holds a PhD from Indiana University, which is going to be brought up here as he introduces our panelists. So, Jeff?
Great. Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Okay, great. Well, thank you. First of all, let me extend my thanks to Pete and Jean and Rudy and all the people who have worked very hard to make this symposium a success. It's great to be a part of the process. It's been a lot of fun, and I've enjoyed what we've been learning so far. One of the things that I think is interesting that I was talking to Bob about earlier today was how hard it is sometimes to keep the idea of discourse central to the ideal of civil discourse. So much of what we've talked about already today involves things like big institutions, Congress, the presidency, the media, and we forget that this often trickles down into the ways that we talk every day to one another. And so for those of you who might not know, when we say we have a panel on rhetoric and culture, what we're really looking to do is talk about how meaning emerges from the relationality amongst people. Even some of the words that we've been hearing today, we know have different kinds of meaning. Certainly center for the political center means different things for different people: radical, liberal, conservative, civility. But also words like objectivity, bias, logical, principled, and best even. These are all words that I just jotted down that don't have one coherent meaning. They come out of certain kinds of relations that we have with one another, and I'm excited that we have a wonderful panel to discuss that today. I'm reminded of the way that language structures reality for us, thinking back to one of my favorite opinion polls from the mid-1990s, which found that the public liked Hillary Clinton 20% more than they liked Hillary Rodham Clinton. And the inclusion of that one extra word largely shaped how they understood that particular political body in the polis. So today I'm very excited to learn from our panelists. We have a great group. First of all, Dr. Robert Ivie is a professor in the Departments of American Studies and Communication at Indiana University in Bloomington. His scholarship focuses on rhetoric as a mode of political critique and a theory of cultural production, with particular emphasis on democracy and its relationship to the problem of war. Bob is the author of dozens of books and articles, including the books Dissent from War and Democracy in America's War on Terror. He has been the editor of 3 leading journals in communication studies, including the Quarterly Journal of Speech and Communication and Critical Cultural Studies. Professor Ivie has also directed a number of important dissertations, most notably mine. Thank you for being here. Dr. Gerald Wetlaufer is a professor of law at the University of Iowa. A graduate of Yale Law School, Dr. Wetlaufer practiced law for 12 years in Washington, D.C. before giving up his partnership and coming to teach law at Iowa in 1984. He teaches courses in federal civic procedure, negotiations, and something called systems of belief and forms of argument in American law. Of relevance to his presentation today, he has published articles on rhetoric and its denial in legal discourse, systems of belief and forms of argument in modern American law, the rhetorics of negotiation, the forms and limits of integrative, i.e. win-win bargaining, the ethics of lying in negotiations. His interests are in negotiation, very broadly defined, in rhetoric, argumentation, legal theory, critical theory and philosophy, and in the ethics of strategic behavior. And finally, Andre Brock is an assistant professor at the University of Iowa, holding a joint appointment in the School of Library and Information Sciences and the Project of Rhetoric and of Inquiry. His research examines cultural and racial identities on the internet and in other digital environments. Recent publications include analyses of racialized critiques of an open source web browser and representations of race and gender in video games. He has also spoken on racial representations on the Press Citizen blogs during Poiroy's 2009 public rhetoric seminar, Media, Space, and Race, the Case of the Southeast Side in Iowa City. We'll start today with Professor Ivie, whose talk is entitled, Is Democratic Civility Oxymoronic?
Jeff made me think that as a student of rhetoric, I promote ambiguity and incoherence, strategically, of course. There's actually some value in that, I think, at some times. In listening to the earlier panels, it kind of helped me get a sense of where my interests overlap and where my starting points are somewhat different than some of the other speakers, who were all very interesting to listen to. But I realized that my interests and the way I'm going to talk about this today come a lot out of my concern with democratic culture writ large. And as you know, some of the other presentations are kind of focused on doing the work of Congress right now, or running for office and getting elected, those kinds of political actions. And so I'm interested in that context in civic engagement, in participation, in problems of civic disengagement, such as motivated by alienation, or even by a sense of the irrelevancy of the political to the everyday life world. And I'm taken with people who write about our democratic culture as being a relatively thin democratic culture, and we celebrate it, but it's kind of an empty symbol, and sometimes it's more a matter that we promote to legitimize and justify foreign policy or whatever, and something that we don't practice quite as robustly, perhaps, as the one essential nation should, that sort of thing. So those are kind of that's kind of the realm in which my thinking is operating. And with that in mind, as a kind of a framing move, I wanted to just say that I'm going to use the time I have to address three questions. One of which is the question that makes for the title of my talk, three questions about civility and democracy. The first is the notion of democratic civility a contradiction in terms? Is it oxymoronic? The second question is, well, if it isn't entirely oxymoronic, is there a democratic limit to incivility? And then the third one is, if there is some kind of a limit to incivility, what may be democracy's biggest rhetorical challenge? And that might be a cue that I actually take rhetoric as not the problem, but as a discourse of democratic practice, as a very robust discourse of democratic practice. And it's really a question of what kind of rhetoric we practice. It's not that just all bad things are rhetorical. So those are some of my working assumptions here. And if I could talk just a little bit more before I turn to the first question about my sense of rhetoric. And you could get a number of different people up here who make rhetoric the subject of their study, and they might have a somewhat different sense of rhetoric than I do. But I think of rhetoric as a lens that focuses attention on a full-throated and dramatic discourse of democratic deliberation. Reason, emotion, character, those things are intertwined and inseparable when we're doing democracy. A key concern of a democratic rhetoric, in my view at least, is avoiding an overly narrow frame of reference, a frame that excludes or undervalues the multiple perspectives and interests that comprise a plural and diverse polity. So a key concern is how narrow the frame of the deliberation gets. And that's usually a sign to me of a potentially problematic rhetoric. Theatricality, performance, emotion, those are part and parcel of the rhetorical act, and they play a role in resisting exclusion. And they play a role in reframing debates that may get framed too narrowly. And there's already been some reference to that in some of the earlier panels, reminding us that movements like civil rights, women's rights, gay rights, environmental movements, anti-war movements, etc., are experiences we've had where people performed theatrically serious dramas, public dramas, to try to break through a narrow frame and get on the table perspectives and concerns and agendas that simply couldn't be given voice reasonably and rationally in the old, more narrow frame. The Occupy movement, it's just what's more fascinating and interesting right now when you pick up the newspaper than the Occupy movement. And at least momentarily, this has actually had some effect in shifting the primary news frame from a focus on deficits to a focus on jobs. And so, there's a theatricality to it that's important to try to widen the theme. Now, I think that's the first thing. The second thing I would say from my rhetorical perspective is that when you think of a political discourse, democratic discourse, as a rhetorical practice, for good or ill, one of the things that, for me at least, does is alerts me to, given its characteristics, to the melodramatic tendencies of political discourse toward oversimplification and toward vilification. I mean, it's just sort of the nature of the beast, if you look at it through a rhetorical lens. And then that implies then that if we're going to be alert to these processes, we need to be alert to the corresponding need for compensatory gestures of identification. That's just part of the ecology of political discourse. So with that as a sort of opening orientation, let me turn to this first question of whether an idea of democratic civility is oxymoronic, is a contradiction in terms. And I would say my answer to that question is yes, it is. It is, up to a point. I think in its most robust sense, civility is about politeness, it's about graciousness, it's about character, it's about respect for others, openness, about seeking common ground in order to foster dialogue. And it resists polarization, it resists acrimony, and most of us really appreciate that most of the time. But it can, if it becomes something of a fetish, narrow the horizon of what is politically legitimate to talk about. Unpleasantness is part of a robust democratic give and take. Politics is conflict over public policy. Politics is about advocacy. Politics is about confrontation. Constructive confrontation focuses more on solutions than on personal attacks, I'll grant you that. But it's never entirely a matter of separating the person from the problem. Not real human beings really talking to each other about things they really care about. So we should expect a healthy democratic politics to be raucous and unruly rather than polite and uncivil. I just really kind of want to make that the default condition rather than making civility the default condition. Cornell Clayton, who is a political scientist who functions as director of the Thomas Foley, as a former member of his constituency, I should never mispronounce his name, Institute for Public Policy and Public Service at Washington State University. Clayton warns that we shouldn't be too eager to jump on what he calls the civility bandwagon. He points out that what passes as civil isn't fixed, it isn't universal, it's time-bound, it's situation-bound, it's culturally sensitive. It's also, he points out, tied to matters of power. And it has implications for the degree to which you achieved the value of the democratic value of equality. And he points out that the powerful are more able to represent their interests in conventional, acceptable civil discourse than those who are outsiders. So incivility, in a certain degree, incivility is functional in that it empowers excluded groups. It serves the democratic value of inclusion, especially in times of deep disagreement over fundamental values, when the world is undergoing substantial economic and social changes, changes that raise questions about national identity, really disruptive, disorienting kinds of things. Those are moments when I think we have to be open to the functionality of something that might sound to us as incivil. So that then leads me to the second question. Is there a democratic limit to incivility? Even if you were to grant me, I usually get slapped down on that point, but even if you were to grant me that there's a certain value to a certain degree of incivility, then the question becomes, is there a democratic limit to incivility? And the answer that I would offer for that question is also yes. There's a point, I think, where almost all of us would agree. There's some kind of a point that we might locate differently, but where mudslinging, nastiness, negativity, bitterness, and just overall coarseness becomes democratically counterproductive. There's a point where incivility reduces debate over really difficult issues, even given that politics is that domain where we have to exercise judgment, where there isn't just some resort to truth, but these are matters of opinion and judgment. On issues like immigration, taxation, education policy, healthcare, unemployment, budget deficits, warfare, things like that rent us sometimes. There's a point where incivility reduces the political to a shouting match and a partisan gridlock. Even then, there will be parties who might think that gridlock is actually something that is a positive outcome, especially, let's say, they want to starve the beast, as some folks take that position. So while incivility isn't unique in our times, to our times, it never feels particularly good when it happens, and especially if you're on the receiving end of rude and bitter outbursts. And I could go down a list of them, but all of us can supply lists of them, and some of them are worse than others. And so I'll just pass over the examples that I was going to use. We've already had several put on the table today. But given that, what is then the limit of incivility? And again, let me say that I would want that limit to come later rather than sooner. But I would say that limit is reached when and only when demonizing discourse reduces political adversaries to sheer enemies. I think, that's a matter of judgment as to when you get there, but that's absolutely the minimal condition for the possibility of democracy to occur. And this occurs when adversaries speak of their antagonists as demonic instead of as badly mistaken, even horribly mistaken. When they start talking about them as evil and demonic, you've moved out of the realm of persuasion and into the realm of coercion. And a democratic politics has to operate in the realm of persuasion. So this point of demonization is where we begin to lose the requisite minimum of common ground required to engage in democratic contestation, at least in my view. Now, it's important for me to underscore here that what I'm talking about is not that we come to some consensus. That's a different kind of model. Deliberative democracy tends to privilege consensus. Rhetorical democracy doesn't so much privilege. You need a working, a critical mass by whatever the rules of decision-making are in the given situation, whether it's a majority vote, a two-thirds vote, or whatever the circumstances are. You need enough folks behind it to be able to make a choice and move forward. But it's essential that we have enough common ground that we're able to actually engage in a robust give and take. And if we've reached the point of demonization where our political adversaries are rendered as sheer enemies, that is where we don't have that minimum kind of common ground. Tom DeLuca and John Buell capture the point in a colorful title in a book they wrote about this problem. The title of their book is Liars, Cheaters, Evildoers, Demonization and the End of Civil Debate in American Politics. And there they say their working definition of demonization is that to demonize is to use language or symbols in ways that meet two requirements. First, to strongly imply or directly suggest that others have very bad, immoral, or evil qualities and that they are capable of or have actually engaged in immoral deeds. And second, to do so without sufficient evidence, inquiry, justification, or consideration of the consequences. Sort of a twofold thing. One is you call them evil, and the other is you do it readily and quickly without exercising any careful analysis or judgment. The point is not to tame political rhetoric, but instead to enable a robust and inclusive democratic give and take by respecting the basic boundary line between civility and incivility. Or another way of putting that is democracy is more fully realized. A more fully realized democracy is democracy with fewer demons. So that leads me to my third question. What may be democracy's biggest rhetorical challenge? To approach that question, I want to think of incivility and its incidence as a sign, a symptom of political culture. A state of polarizing demonization may indicate there's stresses and strains in the polity. And ask what kind of a political discourse is required to address these stresses and strains well enough to provide the minimum of common ground required for engaging in a robust democratic contestation of interests, priorities, and opinions. Thinking of common ground again as an enabling practice, enabling contestation. Given that the tectonics of globalization are shaking the political ground with violent force, I think we may be challenged today under the conditions of discourse that so often resort to incivility, in the extreme that we begin to construct our political adversaries as sheer enemies. I think that that may be an exigency to return to a discourse of citizenship that has been around, but it's never been privileged. Like in a liberal democracy, we privilege the discourse of liberalism. And that's the discourse of civic republicanism, which positions itself somewhere in between, in the middle of a continuum between liberalism and radical individualism on one side, and tribalism or radical communitarianism on another side. And the thing about civil republicanism that I think might be particularly relevant to addressing a problem of incivility today is that it particularly focuses attention on the need to articulate relations of interdependency, rather than going all individualism, all community. So as Isolt Hanahan, who's written a book on civic republicanism, says, civic republicanism addresses the problem of freedom among human beings who are necessarily interdependent. I think this notion of interdependency is something that needs to get articulated in the present context. And I think there's at least a coincidence here, which is when I study the rhetoric of war, I also end up sometimes reading about strategic peace-building communication. And when I read about conflict transformation models and reconciliation models and things like that, I keep coming up with the primary criterion for coping with situations that have been reduced to coercion and violence, and we're trying to reconstruct them into more productive cultures of nonviolent contestation and conflict. Is interdependency, the ability to articulate some sense of interdependency between those who have seen themselves as alienated entirely from one another. So the confluence of the civic republican concern with interdependence and the peace-building emphasis on interdependency, to me, is a sign of the kind of rhetorical challenge facing us today in the pursuit of what Chantal Mouffe would call agonistic pluralism. We've got a pluralistic society, we have a politics of contestation, we have to have some minimum shared symbolic space in order to productively contest our different points of view. Another way of looking at it is we need to get beyond the logic of structural violence. The logic of structural violence is I get mine at your expense. That's a win-lose logic. You need to get to a sense of interdependence, and it would be a sense of win-win or lose-lose. We lose together or we win together by combining our differences in ways that are productive. So I think that for me, this raises the issue of, as a rhetorician, I need to start asking questions about how do you articulate interdependency? Or as a rhetorician, I might frame that as, what are the topoi of interdependency? Where do we start? And I think one of those potential topoi, and it's a discourse that I don't think we're particularly practiced in, but I do think there are cultural resources that could be dug up and privileged to help become more practiced in. It'd be a discourse or a rhetoric of complementarity. Complementarity is a topos, if you will. The ability to talk about partnership relationships so that it's the differences that we bring enriches the hierarchy by widening and deepening it, and we're better. Some of us are better at some things, some of us are better at other things, and by putting those betters together, we all actually, there's a synergistic plus outcome there. It's not a relationship where I promote my interests at your expense. I think under the conditions that we're faced with today, these are the kinds of rhetorical discourses that we need to be able to develop more competency within. And of course that would lead to a fourth question, which would be, how do you articulate topoi like complementarity? But fortunately for me, my time's used up.
My name is Gerald Wetlaufer, and I teach at the law school, having practiced law for a good long while before that. And the teaching and the scholarship that I do is deeply concerned with these subjects related to argument and advocacy and discourse and civility, democracy, ethics, and morality, and the idea of talking about all of that in 15 minutes feels a little bit like Do the Meaning of Life, ready, go. I trust you won't expect too much, and I will offer far more questions and problems than I will answers and solutions. I would begin with the assertion that words matter, that speech and speech acts matter, that discourse and rhetoric matters, that they are the things out of which we have been shaped and by which we continue to be shaped as individuals and as communities. They are how we constitute ourselves. If we are going to do so, we will constitute ourselves as a working democracy. Let me offer a handful of examples of speech acts that I think we know to have had an effect. Declaratory speech act in the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal is part of my DNA. It wasn't when I was conceived, but it was, but it has been for almost my entire life. The speeches given by Adolf Hitler and Winston Churchill, the propaganda films made by Leni Riefenstahl and Frank Capra shaped our understandings of who we are, who they are, what we're engaged in, what's at stake, what's worth putting at risk. The powerful narratives and the visual rhetoric of Pearl Harbor and the collapse of the Twin Towers and Bull Connor's fire hoses and attack dogs on the streets of Birmingham being deployed against children, or the violence done to John Lewis and others of the Freedom Riders, or the death of, or the story of the death, the power of the death of the children who died in the bombing of the Baptist Church in Birmingham. Fannie Lou Hamer's testimony to the Credentials Committee, King's speech at the Lincoln Memorial, and so on. These are all speech acts by which I have been shaped. Well, not Hitler so much, but they are all speech acts that we know to have shaped us collectively. If that's true of speech and speech acts and discourse and rhetoric, I think it's also true of power and violence. I'm not pleased with that, but I think it's demonstrably true. That brings me to the question of reason, argument, and civility. And those are the questions that I will next address. And the answer as to those questions, as to how much difference those make and of what kind, I think are much more complicated. I practiced 12 years in Washington, mostly doing complex federal litigation. I had the honor of working with a friend and mentor by the name of Tom Matthews. Tom was a ferociously enthusiastic litigator. He loved the contest. The more complex, the higher the stakes, the more he loved the contest. But he was also, I think, the only litigator that I've ever known who I never once heard speak ill of his adversaries. It is customary among litigators, there are a certain list of words that by which you begin calling the lawyers on the other side. Sometimes they deserve it, sometimes they don't. But they arise spontaneously in the offices of litigating lawyers. And Tom never reflected that sentiment. But what I want to do is talk about two arguments, both involving Tom, and the contrast between those two arguments. The first argument is at 2 in the morning. We're in the office. We haven't decided what we're going to do the next day in court. We haven't settled on our argument. That's what we're arguing about. The argument is passionate. It is loud. I wouldn't describe it as especially civil. There is finger pointing and table pounding. But what marked those arguments was that there always came a time, always, when one or the other of us would say, "You're right. Yours is the better approach. Let's do it that way." And we would. The other argument that I want to contrast that with is the argument that we made the next day in court. Having settled on that first argument, now we take it into court. And when we're in court, many things are different. First of all, everybody's very polite, very civil. No one's yelling. No one's waving their arms or pounding their fists on the table or pointing at their adversaries or turning colors or behaving in any uncivil way. Perfect civility and politeness. The argument that goes on, that second argument that goes on in court is fundamentally different than the argument the night before. And the core difference between the two arguments is that in the second of the two arguments, neither of the participants will ever, ever, ever stop, pause, and say, "You know, Your Honor, she may be my adversary, but she's right about this." And I think that that captures the difference between two radically different kinds of argument. And one way to, and it's not a difference in civility. It's a difference somewhere else, somewhere in the domain of purpose. The purpose for which we're arguing and the commitments that we carry with us when we go into the argument. And in the first argument, our purpose is we have a shared purpose of finding the best answer to some complicated question, some tactical, rhetorical, argumentative, strategic question. But our purpose is shared. And we're listening to each other. And we're not just listening to each other, we're actually listening to each other out of the possibility that we might be persuaded. That's not what happens the next day. The next day, we listen differently to the other side's arguments. Our purposes are different. Our purpose is to win our argument. And if that's to happen, they're going to have to lose. The purpose of our listening is different. We are not listening with a view to the possibility that they might have something useful to say. We are listening in our commitment to winning for the purpose of, if we're listening at all, coming up with a killer rebuttal, or we might not be listening, but rather spending that time rehearsing our counter-argument, the one that we've already got in place. And assent will never arise under those purposes, under those circumstances. And thus I would draw a distinction between two kinds of arguments, and one of them is an argument in which we have shared purposes, and another is an argument in which our purpose is to win. Our purpose and our commitments with respect to that argument are winning. So I'm a little critical of this idea of advocacy, as lawyers understand the term, of partisanship. Maybe a lot critical of it. Now, let me be clear that there are a couple of distinctions that I'm not making. I am not distinguishing between arguments that are sound and arguments that are unsound. Advocates will sometimes, for the purpose of promoting their individual interest or that of their client, advance the best or soundest argument. But they can be counted on to do so only when that argument happens to be the one that best serves their purposes. Otherwise, they will advance an argument that might be less sound, even in their own judgment, but that better is more likely to serve their purposes. And of course, if one's partisan, if one's adversary happens to be best served by the best or soundest argument, then it is our duty, our obligation to oppose that argument, notwithstanding the fact that it is, or we may know that it is best. So there's another distinction between arguments that are sound and arguments that are not. It's not a distinction between arguments that are polite and arguments that are not, or emotional and not. It involves a distinction in which there are differences in the purposes for which we listen and in our readiness to acknowledge the weakness of our own position or the strength or legitimacy of our adversaries. And lawyers, as advocates, never concede error. They may faint if they find themselves in a hopeless position. Sometimes that happens. But they will never acknowledge that the other's is the better argument. So we've got two kinds of arguments. And I don't want to suggest that this is just found in the domain of the adversarial system. Indeed, the adversarial system in law has at least one place where the kind of argumentation that I'm describing could conceivably produce the right answer. And that's the place where the lawyers are arguing the law in front of a judge who is qualified and objective enough to assess their arguments and has access to all of the texts from which they are arguing. Under those circumstances, I trust the court to distinguish between the bad arguments and the good arguments. But most of the time lawyers engage in that argument. They're sitting across the table from another lawyer, engaged in, for instance, a negotiation. There's no third party. There's no assurance that the better argument will prevail or that the worse argument will be called out. And even the judge sitting on questions of fact, because he can't look behind what the lawyers have shown him to be the facts, is at their mercy in terms of how they are telling the story. And in that sense, he's unable to look behind these adversarial statements. Doug Walton is a brilliant student of argument, and in a certain sense, he generalizes this point in the following way. Arguments are comprised of propositions. These propositions entail commitments. And when they're offered an argument, they entail the commitment on the part of the speaker to support that idea, that proposition with reasons. And if he can't, to give ground somehow. That's all pretty routine stuff. But what Walton did that I thought was just brilliant was he came up with the idea of dark side commitments. Now, of course, my students all assume that he's making reference to the Star Wars or something, and he's not. He's talking about the dark side of the moon. But he's talking about those propositional commitments that have not been spoken, but that in our minds support and sustain our arguments and convictions and beliefs. And because they're not spoken, they can't be subjected to argument. And that most of the time when we're engaged in arguments, we have dark side commitments of one kind or another. It might be a commitment to, it might just be a commitment to winning for the sake of winning. Now, we wouldn't list that among the reasons supporting our claim, but if the other side were to persuade us, they would have to get hold of that dark side commitment, speak to it, and change it. It might be a commitment to a client and a client's interest. We're not going to stand in front of the court and say, we're here, Your Honor, because these fine gentlemen back here are paying us $400 an hour to be here. No, it goes without saying, but it's not made explicit. And because that's true, and because we owe them a duty, we're not going to be persuaded, because we're not going to let go of that dark side commitment. Similarly, when somebody engages in a debate and is assigned one side or the other of the debate, they've got a dark side commitment, unstated, which will hold their position in place and make them immune from persuasion. And you may get a great debate, but I assume that debaters don't very often say, gee, you know, you're right, they've got me on that one. And sometimes self-interest is such a dark side commitment, and sometimes political commitments are a dark side commitment. How many of us have engaged in arguments over the Clinton impeachment or the weapons of mass destruction with somebody whose politics were different from us, and lo and behold, we just couldn't reach an agreement. And we were never going to reach an agreement with them, because our position and theirs was held in place by an unstated dark side commitment to a political party, or a political candidate, or a political office holder, or maybe to a philosophy. I don't know, it could be that too. And the result is that because we not only have dark side commitments to which we are deeply and strongly bound, agreement is not going to happen in those circumstances. And unless somebody can show us that we've misunderstood our own interest. Let me give you a brief digression into how I spent about 20 years of my life when I started teaching law school. When I began teaching in the mid-1980s, early 90s, the legal academy was not just balkanized, but each of the states was at war with the others. And it was a particular arena of the culture wars that were common in the academy at the time. There were people who were doing law and economics, and there were people who were doing critical legal studies, and there were people who were doing legal process, and there were people who were doing sort of British-influenced analytic philosophy. And all of these were ships passing in the night. And within any one of those ships, there was an operating system, there was a set of assumptions that made sense, and people could hold conversations and sometimes reach agreements. But as between those ships, there was no communication at all. And there was only enmity and disrespect and disregard. And the declaration that all those people on all those other ships, they just don't understand whatever, the nature of justice. And I thought, okay, I'm gonna look hard at these 6 operating systems. Oh, and one of the things that made it interesting is that while we had these 6 operating systems at work in the law, we were teaching our first-year law students that they were supposed to learn legal reasoning, and the legal reasoning that we presented to them was a mixed hodgepodge, a mixed deck of these moves made in these 6 operating systems that could not be understood together. Though any of them taken alone is easy. And I thought, okay, I'll get to the bottom of it. I'll figure out what the issues are that separate us, and see if I can't get us to join issue on those things. And then we can maybe stop yelling and start having a dialogue. And I did that, and I identified a whole list of differences that existed between these schools, different understandings of human nature, different understandings of the legitimacy of the existing order, differing understandings as to the determinacy of law, or the possibility of neutral reason, or the nature and consequences of language, or the nature of the good, which for law and economics is maximizing aggregate wealth, which is, just incidentally, that which is automatically maximized by the operation of a freely operating perfect market. That's their understanding of the good. And economists won't claim that, but the proponents of law and economics operate on that assumption. And it's easy to learn that system, and it has enormous weight. Well, what I discovered is nothing changed. Nothing changed, because even if we were able to identify the underlying differences, first, people weren't willing to talk about those underlying differences because they didn't have the language in which to talk about them. It was just too hard. What do you mean you want me to debate my understanding of the nature of human nature? And even if they were to try, they wouldn't succeed. It wouldn't change. Agreements that couldn't be reached because of those differences still couldn't be reached because of those differences. So I'm not real optimistic about reasoned argument as something that is going to lead us towards persuasion and consensus. I'm not as optimistic as an academic ought to be about the possibility of reasons, or the possibility or necessity of civility, because there are differences, and there will continue to be. Okay, I think maybe the answer is compromise. Everybody should just listen in good faith and then split the difference, because everybody counts. And then I think about the 1964 Democratic National Convention and the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. And there was this great episode in which Hubert Humphrey and A. Philip Randolph were sent by LBJ to persuade Robert Moses and Aaron Henry and Fannie Lou Hamer that they ought to take the 2 observer seats that they had been offered and declare victory, because this was politics they were engaged in. And they said no. I'm sorry. If we had been willing to take what we could get, we would have stopped 200 years ago and gotten nowhere. We have only gotten somewhere by standing on principle. And that's what they're going to do. And I think there's a perfectly sound argument for doing that under those circumstances. If compromise isn't the answer, is ethics the answer? I could give you, but won't, a detailed understanding and pretty demanding understanding of my ethics of argument and discourse. It doesn't solve all the problems, but it tends to moderate the problems. But if you're willing to implement a demanding set of ethics under circumstances where the other side isn't, you really are going to pay a cost in terms of your own commitments and your own effectiveness. While I'm prepared to engage in unilateral disarmament on these matters, I'm not prepared to urge it upon others whose needs are greater. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Andre Brock. I'm an assistant professor, as Jeff has pointed out with the help of my excellent introduction. I'm an assistant professor at the School of Library and Information Science and the project on the rhetoric of inquiry. Today's discussion, actually I was prescient enough to have divined the minds of my co-presenters, so I will be talking about ambiguity in discourse, or the lack thereof, as well as the ways in which speech and speech acts constitute us, and in turn are constituted by us. So, this is fun. This is called, this talk will be called Obama, Whiteness, and Political Identities Online, and I chose the wrong color font, so you might not be able to see that that's a hyperlink to the website stuffwhitepeoplelike.com, which you may have heard of. Okay, so some of you may have heard of it, right? And these are some of the first topics that Christian Lander, the author of the site, found that he felt symbolized the ways in which white people define themselves. And if you notice, Barack Obama, number 8, is up there, and having black friends is number 14. So I chose to talk about Barack Obama to kind of fit in with the theme of this symposium, and the ways in which his black, biracial, and white identity shape discourses about politics and the construction of white identities in this particular space. So the slide is often going to say things that I'm not saying, because I have faith in the intelligence of my audience that you can read and listen at the same time. I'm just saying, because sometimes it's going to get kind of dense, but I have faith in you. But if I talk too fast, raise your hand, say slow down, I'll slow down. Okay. In recent years, in the public sphere and in mainstream online spaces, conservatism has created a counter-narrative for whiteness. Conservative whites are constructed as beleaguered defenders of American ideals such as self-reliance, patriotism, and personal responsibility. And we have great examples of this up here, although he's not white. It's close enough to count. Okay, wait. I also have explicit political views, so I apologize for that. So Herman Cain's perspective as the frontrunner of the GOP presidential candidates is that African Americans have been brainwashed into not being open-minded, not even considering a conservative point of view. And then he was supported in this assertion by noted conservative intellectual, and Coulter, who said that the source of why liberals detest conservative blacks is that it's ironic in a cruel, vicious, and horrible way that civil rights laws were designed to protect blacks from Democrats. So the ways in which blackness is deployed as a way to define both the Republican Party and their politics is of interest to me. But we don't get to just pick on conservatives in this game. We can also talk about Melissa Harris Perry's recent article. And one of the interesting things about her article was that she used her platform to call to task the ways in which liberals have stepped away from support of President Obama. And her quote, which I won't read just because I trust your reading comprehension, is kind of supportive of a statement made by Bell Hooks, who famously noted that white liberals believe that all ways of looking that highlight difference subvert the liberal belief in a universal subjectivity, or we are all just people, that they think will make racism disappear. They have a deep emotional investment in their myth of sameness, even as their actions reflect the primacy of whiteness as a sign informing who they are and how they think. And the reason why I say this is evocative of Bell Hooks, this Melissa Harris Perry's article is evocative of Bell Hooks' statement is because as soon as she published it, we got a quote from her good friend Joan Walsh, the editor of Salon.com, and she proceeds to continue to expand upon the idea of race as a warrant for political activity. So she says that I thought the white left in particular projected hugely when it anointed Obama the definitive progressive, but then adds, looking for racial motives to explain why white liberal disappointment with Obama in the face of so many economic reasons seems unnecessarily divisive. And so I bring these two examples up to show that the ways in which race informs politics is not going to ever be very civil, although couched in civil terms. And in many ways, it's foundational to the ways in which people understand the world. And I bring you to that particular understanding through a vehicle called Stuff White People Like. And in particular, the blog post number 8, Barack Obama. Now, this obviously is a touchstone of white identity. I say that because in my writing of this article and my discussion of this image with students, I incorrectly identified the woman over whom shoulder Barack Obama is leaning with a crazy straw as Chloe. Who is this woman, audience? See what I mean? I just failed that one altogether. Okay, so Stuff White People Like is the creation of Christian Lander and details his take on how certain white people appropriate or even appreciate certain cultural items, attitudes, and practices that are not their own, quote unquote. His tongue-in-cheek delineation of white identity, cultural commonplaces, is notable for its deconstruction of a norm of American identity, but also for the humorous tone he employs. Because in many cases, most people don't think whiteness is funny. Well, black comedians do, but that's different. Many previous exemplars of white online identity that I consider in my work draw energy from conservative political movements. So I don't know if you remember Pat Buchanan's response to Barack Obama's speech in 2008, A Brief for Whitey, right? And the amount of vitriol against non-whites in current online political discourse and non-political is kind of hard to read. For me, Stuff White People Like's other draw was the immense amount of audience participation. So first, it does really good examples of cultural touchstones, but then it has immense numbers of comments, 13,000 in August for this one post, 16,000 as of today. I went back and checked just for fun. And it serves as a remarkable online community as well as a multiple articulations of online racial identity. So this post, number 8, was published January 19th, 2008, right before the website got pretty popular. And it's very short, and that's the entire post right under the picture, because white people are afraid if they don't like them, they'll be called racist. And in these 16 words, Lander manages to note how black identity serves as a boundary for white identity. He criticizes colorblind rhetoric, and he critiques liberal white attitudes towards race. With this post, he treads a line of racial satire popularized by Dave Chappelle, whose comedy sketches often riffed mockingly about race relations, if you remember the racial draft, in a way that highlights the shortcomings of colorblind racial ideology. Lander's approach is exacerbated by brevity, because by making this really kind of ambiguous yet confrontational statement, he allows people to build their own assertions on what he hasn't said as much as what he has said. So it's exacerbated by brevity as well as through its inflammatory tone, and the latitude of interpretation and the challenge to white perceptions of racial equanimity eventually sparked into a rowdy discussion of white identity in the comments. Okay, so this is me as junior faculty attempting to show you that I am a researcher, something my esteemed colleagues don't have to do anymore. So a little bit of a talk about online identity. Identity formation online interweaves beliefs about racial identity and technoculture. And by technoculture, I usually define that as the ways in which we believe technology shapes the world and the world about us. Primarily limited to discursive markers, online interactions employ offline identities, and yes, I know there's YouTube and Facebook, but the majority of the interactions that you have with the internet these days is text, right? So they employ offline identities to shape social interactions in digital spaces. On blogs, such as Stuff White People Like, these interactions are framed by a platform displaying content drawing from the author's interests and the conception of her audience, and most online spaces do not choose to highlight culturally specific content, which leads to erroneous beliefs about the internet's universal appeal and content that is actually targeted toward the most profitable marketing demographic, which you may guess is, okay, never mind, white affluent males. I selected this site based upon Lander's marking and excavation of a particular white identity in a space where the default identity is popularly acknowledged to be white, male, and middle class. And while whiteness is understood as a default identity, whiteness online, and probably offline as well, is largely unexamined except when it's deviant in some fashion. In nearly every post in this blog, Lander's tongue-in-cheek definitions of white normality gets discursively clarified, challenged, and even destroyed by the commenters. And these multiple perspectives on white online identity offer a unique opportunity for information studies as a critical race technology. As a unique opportunity for information studies, going too fast again. As a critical race technology scholar, I often argue that whiteness is articulated as a hidden norm in technological practices, artifacts, and beliefs. Lander's association of Obama with friends serves multiple purposes. Oh wait, I said that already. Ooh. So, moving right along. The questions that I'll be asking or hoping to answer during this presentation are really short and simple. How is white identity constructed online? And you'll see that it's through discourse, but through specific topoi and cultural artifacts. And how do these articulations of white identity online compare to the commonly understood default white male middle class identity? And then finally, how does racial identity shape political discourse online? My analysis is something that I crafted from other people's approaches as well as some stuff of my own called critical technocultural discourse analysis, which is an interface analysis of a particular digital object, so for this case the blog, plus discourse analysis, and both of these analyses are framed by critical race theory and technocultural theory. So I pulled technoculture from a theorist named Arnold Pacey, who describes technology as a tripartite entity, artifacts, practices, and beliefs. And he says that popular conceptions of technology hide the belief aspect of technologies and force us to consider them only in terms of what they are and what they do. And this encourages perceptions of technology as value neutral, as well as preserving existing social hierarchies and structures of domination. So the artifact for this one is blogs and their comments. The practice that I'm examining is discourse between blog commenters, although it's a specific discourse, and the beliefs are racial and technocultural ideologies. I selected 1/3 of the comments that I had at the time. When I started, it was 8,000. So I had about 2,000, 2,500 comments that I looked at, coding for topical discussions of racial identity and political identity. And so I also included comments that specifically reference the medium, and that's important later, because I did say I was going to do interface analysis. I included comments that specifically reference the medium, as it is important to understand how the medium and the venue influence the discourse. The comments are threaded, so in many cases these are replies to other replies, unmoderated, which means that the lander never came back and said, you're right, you're wrong, so these are all arguments between each other. And they are kind of sort of hierarchically, temporally sequential. So that means that somebody may have commented in March and there will be comments under that comment that are in date order, but those comments can be anywhere from that first day that it was posted to today. So I have comments in my code that were made in, again, March 2009, and then there are responses to it in April 2011 and so forth. Okay. Hopefully that makes sense. The following slides that I'm going to get to very shortly highlight comments selected from larger code groups within the code category white identity. And this is analysis in a very loose sense, simply to help you guys see what I was trying to make sense of looking at this blog. And then last but not least, critical whiteness and technoculture. This much was evident, if only in the music I heard all around me, and then in so many other linguistic, cultural, rhetorical, and spiritual ways. White Americans did not realize how black they were. Even their whiteness, I discovered, was partially built on the fear of and attraction to its opposite. And this is Andrew Sullivan, noted commentator for The Atlantic. And this is an example of some of the things that I'm pulling from critical race theory to help you understand how exactly whiteness is constructed. So, for example, pulling from Martha Mahoney, whiteness is contingent, only remarked upon when differences from white norms are revealed. Otherwise, whiteness is normal. And then finally, technoculture is, I know. Okay, good. Technoculture is a matrix of 6 qualities, and these are fun to keep in mind as we go through these excerpts from the blog. Progress, religion, modernity, the future, whiteness, and masculinity. And that's an argument that Joel Dienerstein made, and to say that these are the belief systems that power our implementations and dissemination of technological artifacts. Right. Let the fun begin. So one of the first coding categories I came up with was not that kind of white. And you read while I talk. These are fun. Many commenters disavowed Lander's claim to a white identity, providing their own take as a rebuttal. Some objected to Lander's use of friends as a commonplace for white identity, and it was a stumbling block for other white commenters. Some picked up on Lander's reference to Obama as an avatar for white liberal identity and quickly and violently dissented. Others deployed a conservative Republican identity, both for and against Obama. Old Man C, oh wait, there's gonna be profanity in here, so I'll just say it, you'll be fine. Old Man C wrote, wow, I must not be very white. I got 4 out of 5 of this whole list, the list from the earlier, the title slide, and I sure as F don't like Barack Obama. This list is pretty funny, but the title should be amended to stuff white, yuppie type, self-hating liberals like. We knuckle-dragging conservatives are mostly perfectly happy not giving two shits about Eastern religions, reparations, or other exotic cultures. Finally, some commenters made a link between education, politics, geography, and whiteness. One commenter wrote, I think that's why he, Obama, won Iowa too. Not all of the state is rural and conservative. The University of Iowa is not only known for its writer's workshop, but for its large population of far-left white kids. I thought that was interesting to me. One of the other ways in which whiteness was defined was through references to a pejorative black identity. And this is another one of those lengthy ones that you get to read while I talk. A number of self-identified non-white commenters responded to colorblind and racist comments, as opposed to the original post about Barack Obama and being liked because liberals are afraid to be racist, to frame white identity by either employing or reversing pejorative black identities. One anonymous commenter responded to this particular one that I have on screen and said, actually, black people don't sniff glue or Fantastic or any other household cleaning item or make drugs from everything under the kitchen sink or drink cough syrup or tip cows or let their kids curse them out in the middle of the mall. We also don't sit out in the sun and commit suicide trying to look the same color as me. And another one added, are you sure you're not talking about white people? I thought bestiality, meth labs, heroin, and sniffing anything to get high was like your coming of age. I do not believe I've seen blacks do any of these things. I could be wrong. I do not know all black people. And then the meat of the matter, politics and race. So as I mentioned earlier, some people employ their political affiliations in order to understand Barack Obama as a candidate, but also to talk about the political situation. So the quotes I have are from I'm White Andy, which she wrote, I'm white and I'll vote for Barack Obama, but prefer John Edwards and hate Friends. Joey added, I'm white, Barack Obama sucks. I don't understand how half of Democratic voters can back someone who has no political accomplishments at all. To counteract these particular don't likes, there are other ways in which their racial attitudes were not affecting their political affiliation. So one educated Republican wrote, I'm Republican, very white, power-centered, and sometimes racist, but even I can see that Obama is the greatest candidate. And then finally, CC wrote, Obama's experience and stance on education win me over, above, and beyond the joy that comes with possibly having a political legacy that has moved beyond race. Yes, race is still an issue and will likely be for a long time to come. We white folks have much work to do. So the ways in which Obama's racial identity play into the constructions of political identity are very salient for the members of these blogs. And these are a very small cross-section of the comments that I came across that employed mentions of Barack Obama both in opposition to Hillary Clinton and John Edwards, as well as his Republican opponent, John McCain. In many ways, never seeking to give him much credit for anything and adding mentions of the ways in which he would turn the United States into a socialist regime. And this is, early 2008. So what can we pull from this? The first part is that blogs serve to frame the ways through both code and through discourse, the ways in which we understand identity articulation online. And so the medium of technology, while not explicit in my analysis, returns in this section. The features and infrastructure of the blog, so the comments, the ads, the pictures, the topic of the post, shape the discourse found within. And in addition to the identity comments that the commenters made, there were also ways in which it was evident that they were aware that they were having this discourse in a public space. And the fact that it was unmoderated and the fact that the site got a lot of traffic was also part and parcel of the ways in which they deployed the arguments that they made. They knew that these comments would get a lot of traction, and so a lot of them set out to be as inflammatory and incendiary as possible. The strongest theme running through the analyzed comments were the differentiation of white identity from Lander's initial position. Given disciplinary, technocultural, and public assumptions of a monolithic race and class white online identity, the variations articulated in the comments were refreshing. One of the things I found but didn't mention was there was a long thread on how Jewishness is and isn't white. I found that while Obama's blackness played a formative role in the commenters' constructions of white identity, it did not operate in isolation. And let's see. So Blogs, oh, that's the part you don't care about, and we won't talk about that. Racial ideology online. Okay, so, racial attitudes shape online interactions regardless of context, but it becomes more apparent when race is a toy. Online interactives deploy race positively and negatively as a warrant to understand society and culture, and power their assertions about everything: political, technological, economic, potty training, educational, artistic, anything you can think about, race can be used as a warrant to understand how people do it. And so Melissa Harris Perry wrote, "In a nation with the racial history of the United States, I am baffled by the idea that non-racism would be the presumption and that it is racial bias which must be proved beyond reasonable doubt. More than 100 years of philosophical, psychological, and sociological research that begins, at least with the work of W.B. Du Bois, has mapped the deeply entrenched realities of racial bias on the American conscience." Okay, so then the other part of this, closing out, is that one of the truisms of internet culture is that the default identity of internet users is white male and middle class. And some of my commenters went a long way to prove that even if it is white male and middle class, there are ways in which to distinguish different variations of whiteness using socioeconomic status, geography, political affiliation, and the like, and religion. So I've frequently argued 2 points in my own research: that ideological ruptures to the prevailing colorblind racial ideology draw attention online, driving participants to declare their racial identity. So there is no such thing as the internet as a raceless, bodiless space. People bring their embodied existences to their online interactions. The other part is that the resultant identities are much more heterogeneous than either technologists or humanists would have us believe. And although these arguments were constructed around my research into black identity, I contend that they should be applicable to any ethnic identity formation online. Although the last 30 years have seen a decrease in overt racist discourse, those harboring such beliefs have become increasingly savvy in disguising their beliefs as colorblind rhetoric or even as satire. The rise of the internet as a discursive space where the public can participate in racial commentary without fear of reprisal has led to a corresponding rise in uncivil discourse on public and private sites alike. I characterize this as an American issue, but am not averse to lightly covering all of Western culture with this tarred brush. As immigration populations continue to thrive in Europe and Australia, online racist and nationalist rhetorics have grown increasingly vitriolic. Although the internet still deserves its attribution as a democratic space, it is unwise to ignore the coercive and hegemonic power it grants as well. And then to close this out, I have 2 quotes from 2 very different political figures. Abraham Lincoln, who wrote that although he wanted to free the slaves, he would not suggest in any way that they were the social and cultural equal of the whites in the country that they lived in. And then my favorite quote, and this was actually in my dissertation, Barbara Bush, following the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, saying, "What I'm hearing and what is sort of scary is that they all want to stay in Texas. And so many of the people in the arena here, you know, were underprivileged anyway, so this is working very well for them." And with that, I'd like to say racism is a fact of all discourses. Race and racism is a fact of all discourses. In some cases, it's prejudice. In other cases, it's structural discrimination. And we need to understand that its role in fomenting and powering several political discourses is here to stay and probably will get worse as time goes on. Thank you. To me, coming from a critical perspective, I understand civility as a way in which it's intended to enhance the power of some and diminish the power of others, right? And so in many cases, as I've come to understand in my journey to the Midwest from New York City, civility can be used as a weapon to distract people from the actual purpose at hand. And I say that because in New York, the discourse mode is when in doubt, escalate. And then in the Midwest, the discourse mode is let's not fight about this, let's be rational. And so trying to negotiate between those 2 traditions helps me to understand that depending on what position you are able to occupy, you can control the discourse in ways that are more favorable to the ways in which you understand the world. If you are ready to understand the world in terms of violent opposition, being civil can be a hindrance to you. Right? If you're ready to understand the world in terms of the perception of consensus, then being civil can aid you. But in both cases, in neither case does it mean that it's better or worse for either party. It's just depending on how they orient themselves to the world. Free speech is actually somewhat of in a similar situation in that, and so this is based on discussion I've had in my class recently, my students have accused me of limiting free speech because I run the class as a professor. And they were under the impression that my class was democratic in nature. And I have no idea. I think it's because I talk about the internet. And so I had to remind them that while they have the freedom to talk about topics that pertain to the class and even topics that contextualize things that we discuss in class, they do not have free speech rights in my class because there is a context to which we must understand. I have to assess your mastery of knowledge. And so I think free speech is the same thing. As a civil and political right, you only get to be free to a certain extent where it does not bump up against the context of violating someone else's humanity, or this is the worst case scenario, violating the hegemony of the state in which you live in this particular case, the United States. And so I see there's similarities to me, more similarities to me between them than there are differences. Both of them require a certain amount of restraint and control that is exercised from above to below. And I think that tries to answer your question. I'm not sure if it does.
If I can add just a little bit, I think somebody really needs to study the appeal that these books, Where the Wild Things Are, what all of these things that we love so much because our children like them, actually do speak to something in us. And on the question of civility, it's clear to me that civility is not infrequently deployed as a way of disciplining people who are asserting things that that the folks around the table don't want to have asserted. And my most personal experience of that arises in watching over the last 25 years the struggle that women have sometimes had in the legal academy, probably in other parts of the academy as well, where if they took their disagreement too far, they were told that they were violating the rules, notwithstanding the fact that from one standard the rules needed to be violated and changed. And you're right, it's a particularly Iowa cultural commitment as well.
I'd just really quickly add that you can exercise free speech in a civil or an uncivil way. But it isn't just a style of speaking. I'm thinking of Martin Luther King. I think his style of speaking was very civil, but his message was heard by some as very uncivil because it was out of the bounds of the imagination of the time, you know. So the two terms, I think, are kind of in tension with each other. The one doesn't reduce to the other.